Unexpected encounter, Jake maneuvered his salvage vessel through the asteroid field, scanning the wreckage with a practiced eye. He had been doing this for years, picking apart the remains of warships and hauling whatever valuable scraps he could find. The war between the humans and Auri had devastated entire colonies, but to Jake, it was just another business. He didn't care about sides, he was a scavenger, taking what was left behind. Today, his target was an Auri warship, a massive, derelict ship drifting through space. Its once sleek hull was now riddled with blast marks and covered in holes. The wreckage had a strange aura, like something felt wrong about it. Auri warships were known for their advanced technology. Their hulls crafted from crystalline alloys that shimmered with an almost ethereal glow. But this ship, once a marvel of design, had become a floating tomb. It was as though the universe had mocked the pride of the Auri people, turning something so beautiful into a pile of twisted metal. Jake gripped the controls of his vessel as he moved it closer, the gravitational pull from the nearby asteroids making each maneuver feel a little more dangerous. His ship's AI, MEA, spoke in its usual calm, monotone voice, though it sounded slightly more urgent this time as the proximity alarms beeped softly. Life signs detected, MEA reported. However, the readings are inconclusive due to radiation interference. Proceed with caution, Jake muttered under his breath and squinted at the screen. Life signs, huh? At least someone's alive in this wreck. He slid his helmet over his head with a soft hiss, sealing himself inside his suit. He glanced at his oxygen levels, 6 hours remaining. More than enough to grab some salvage and get out. Just another day in paradise, he muttered. Without a second thought, Jake launched himself from the airlock, the thrusters on his suit humming softly as they propelled him into the cold, silent vacuum of space. His boots magnetized to the damaged hull with a dull thud as he secured himself to the ship. His headlamp flickered to life, casting harsh shadows over the ship's jagged, scarred surface. What was once a glorious hull was now a mess of twisted metal and shredded alloys. His cutter tool hummed to life in his hand. And the blue-white beam sliced through the damaged airlock door, cutting it away with a screech. As the door fell open, Jake stepped into the wreckage. His boots clicked softly on the metal floor, and the weak emergency lights flickered, casting a pale blue glow over the chaos around him. Wires hung like vines, and broken consoles sparked occasionally, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been breathed in days. The ship's artificial gravity system barely functioned, making each step feel heavier than it should. It was like wading through water, slow and deliberate. His scanner buzzed to life, tagging valuable components and materials for future retrieval. The Auri had built their ships with advanced materials, rare alloys and crystals that fetched a small fortune on the black market. Jake's eyes scanned the results of his scanner, noticing the unique signatures of this particular ship. It was a valuable find, one that could bring in a lot of credits. But something felt wrong. There were no signs of the crew, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Even the Auri, known for their cold precision in battle, always left behind traces of their presence. It didn't make sense. The damage was too severe for the crew to have evacuated without leaving a trace. Jake's hand instinctively reached for his sidearm. He didn't like the emptiness of the ship. It was the kind of silence that made a man uneasy, the kind of stillness that came before something bad. MEA, any distress signals? Anything from the wreck? Jake asked, his voice tense. Negative, the AI responded in its usual cool tone. The sector is silent. Too silent. Jake frowned, a chill creeping up his spine. That's not right. He moved deeper into the ship, his steps cautious as he navigated dark, winding corridors. The faint buzz of broken lights cast strange shadows across the walls, and his feet crunched against debris. His heart raced with a feeling of unease, one he couldn't shake. Finally, he reached the door to the command center. His scanner showed a faint but active signal, something small, but it was alive. The door was jammed halfway open. As he squeezed through the gap, his light fell upon something that made his heart skip a beat. There was a trail of luminescent blue streaking across the floor. At first, Jake thought it was just a trick of the light, but then his stomach dropped. Auri blood, the trail was fresh, still wet. It glowed faintly, almost as if the blood itself had some bioluminescent property. Jake crouched down to examine it. It was thick, almost gel-like in texture, and it spread out in a pattern that suggested someone had been dragged, not walking on their own. The trail led deeper into the ship, down a narrow maintenance shaft that reeked of burnt electronics and blood. Jake followed the trail cautiously. Whoever, or whatever, was still alive aboard this ship was in desperate need of help. And whoever they were injured, possibly gravely so. Jake's mind raced. If there was an Auri survivor, it meant complications. It meant danger. But it also meant a potential bounty. The Alliance offered significant rewards for high-ranking Auri officers captured alive. His eyes narrowed as he weighed the options in his mind. There was money to be made here. But something in him, something he couldn't quite explain, made him hesitate. The trail ended at a small storage compartment. Jake paused, listening. He could hear the faint sound of labored breathing, shallow and rapid, as if whoever was inside was struggling to stay conscious. Drawing his weapon, Jake took a deep breath. His finger hovered over the trigger, and he slowly pushed the door open, ready for whatever he might find, and there, curled against the far wall, was the source of the blood, a young Auri female. She lay trembling, one hand clutching a wound in her side, the other wrapped tightly around the grip of a disruptor pistol. Her skin was burnished copper, marked with intricate patterns that glowed faintly with blue bioluminescence. Her violet eyes locked onto his with a mixture of hatred, fear, and something else, resignation. Jake's heart skipped a beat as she slowly raised her weapon, her fingers trembling from the strain. "Don't," he warned, keeping his voice calm but firm. Her eyes flared with disbelief and fury. Time seemed to stretch between them as the coldness of space pressed in on all sides. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and for a moment, Jake could see the pain etched across her face. She was no ordinary soldier. Her uniform, torn and scorched from battle, bore the insignia of an Auri Special Forces officer, clearly a high-ranking individual. This wasn't just any casualty, she spoke, her voice sharp and strained. "Finish it, human." Jake's finger hovered over the trigger. The bounty, the money, it was right there. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had seen too much death. Too much destruction, and there was something about this moment, something in her eyes, that made him hesitate. Instead of firing, he holstered his weapon, his hands moving to the medical kit at his belt. "I'm not in the business of executing wounded prisoners," Jake muttered, crouching beside her, her eyes widened in confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Something stupid, probably," Jake said with a faint smile, pulling out a med scanner and quickly running it over her side. He winced at the results. "Internal bleeding. You've got a punctured lung. You're going to die if I don't help you." She glared at him, her free hand still clutching her disruptor pistol. "Why would you save me?" she hissed, still clearly baffled by his actions. Jake paused for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. "Maybe I'm tired of this war," he said quietly, his voice softer now, with a hint of something unspoken. He reached for the coagulant injector at his belt and steadied his hand. "This is going to hurt." Before she could protest, Jake pressed the injector against her side, and she gasped. Her free hand instinctively grabbed his arm, and for a moment, he thought she might try to attack him. But instead, she seemed to relax as the pain-blocking agents took effect, the trembling in her body slowly subsiding. Jake didn't wait for her to speak. "I'm getting you to my ship. You're not dying here." Her violet eyes flickered with confusion and suspicion. But something in her expression softened just a little. "Why?" she asked again, her voice barely audible. "Because you're not going to die today," Jake answered simply. He held out his hand. Let's get you out of here, and just like that, despite the war, despite everything that had come before, Jake made a decision that would change everything. The wounded Auri officer, who had expected to die in the cold, unforgiving space, now had a second chance, thanks to a man who didn't care about sides, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them could yet comprehend. Unexpected encounter, she spoke, her voice sharp and strained. Finish it, human. Jake's finger hovered over the trigger. The bounty, the money, it was right there. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had seen too much death, too much destruction, and there was something about this moment, about the look in her eyes, that made him hesitate. Instead of firing, he holstered his weapon, his hands moving to the medical kit at his belt. "I'm not in the business of executing wounded prisoners," Jake muttered as he crouched beside her, her eyes widened in confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Something stupid, probably," Jake said with a faint smile, pulling out a med scanner and quickly running it over her side. He winced at the results. "Internal bleeding. You've got a punctured lung. You're going to die if I don't help you." She glared at him, her free hand still gripping her disruptor pistol. "Why would you save me?" she hissed, clearly baffled by his actions. Jake paused for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. "Maybe I'm tired of this war," he said quietly, his voice softer now, laced with a note of something unspoken. He reached for the coagulant injector at his belt, steadying his hand. "This is going to hurt." Before she could protest, Jake pressed the injector against her side, and she gasped, her free hand instinctively grabbing his arm. For a moment, he thought she might attack him, but instead, she seemed to relax as the pain-blocking agents took effect, the trembling in her limbs slowly fading. Jake didn't wait for her to speak. "I'm getting you to my ship. You're not dying here." Her violet eyes flickered with confusion and suspicion, but something in her expression softened, just a little. "Why?" she asked again, her voice barely audible. "Because you're not going to die today," Jake answered simply. He held out a hand. "Let's get you out of here," and just like that, despite the war, despite everything that had come before, Jake made a decision that would change everything. The wounded Auri officer, who had expected to die in the cold, unforgiving space, now had a second chance, thanks to a man who didn't care about sides, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them could yet comprehend. Alliance on the hunt. As Jake steered the Nomad away from the Auri wreck, the shadow of danger loomed over him. The ship's systems beeped incessantly, warnings flashing across the screen as the Alliance patrol vessels entered the system. The massive ships were armed to the teeth, their engines glowing with a faint blue hue as they locked onto his position. Jake's pulse quickened, but he remained focused, his hands moving rapidly over the controls. "MEA, how long until they get a lock on us?" Jake muttered under his breath, his voice tense. "Approximately 3 minutes, Jake. You must accelerate to evasive speeds," MEA responded, its cool, dispassionate tone doing little to calm his nerves. Neri, who was recovering in the med bay, could feel the tension in the air even though she was far from the cockpit. Her healing was progressing slowly, but she was far from her full strength. She could still sense the strain in Jake's movements, the urgency in his voice. She knew that they were running out of time. "Jake," Neri's voice crackled over the comms, her tone strained but steady, "they're coming. You don't need to do this. I'm no one to you." Jake glanced at the small screen showing her face, her violet eyes narrowed in confusion and suspicion. She was still lying in the med bay, but her mind was alert. Her injuries were severe, but the coagulant and pain-blocking agents had worked wonders. She could feel the ship's acceleration, the tightness in her chest as she struggled to keep herself steady. "I didn't save you for nothing, Neri," Jake replied, his voice firm yet tinged with an edge of something else. "You're not just some target. You're someone I'm not letting die, not today. And I'm not running from these Alliance bastards without giving them a run for their money." Neri was silent for a moment. She didn't understand why Jake had saved her, let alone why he was now risking everything to keep her alive. Humans, in her experience, were driven by agendas, by self-preservation, and yet here was this salvager, an ordinary man by all appearances, throwing his lot in with her, an Auri officer. She had expected him to hand her over to the Alliance. It would have made sense. But instead, he was actively working to escape capture with her aboard his ship. It didn't add up. I don't understand you, human, Neri muttered under her breath, the words faint but audible over the comms. She had never met a human like him before. You've risked your life to save mine. What do you expect from me in return? Jake didn't immediately respond. His hands danced over the controls as he guided the Nomad into the asteroid field, the vast rocks and debris offering temporary cover. He took a sharp turn, the ship shuddering as it dove between two massive asteroids, avoiding a direct hit from one of the Alliance patrol's laser blasts. Just keep your head down, Neri, Jake said. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just want to get us out of here. Neri was taken aback. She had expected him to make demands, perhaps use her as leverage against the Alliance or even attempt to ransom her for a hefty sum. But instead, Jake seemed content to let her rest and heal, focused solely on escaping the pursuit that was closing in around them. It was a foreign concept to her. I thought all humans were soldiers, Neri said after a pause, her voice now quieter, tinged with a hint of confusion. What are you, if not a soldier? Jake's chuckle echoed softly through the comms, a grim humor behind it. Not a soldier anymore. I walked away from that life. I'm just a salvager now, trying to make a living in the aftermath of this damn war. He hesitated, his voice becoming more serious. I've seen enough death on both sides to last me a lifetime. I don't want to keep playing the hero. You walked away. Neri repeated, as if the concept was alien to her. You gave up fighting. I gave up dying for someone else's cause, Jake replied, his voice tight. The war. The battles, none of it means anything when you're just a pawn in a bigger game. I just want to survive. That's all. The moment hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Neri looked at the control panel, her mind racing. She had been raised in a culture where survival was a matter of duty, of fighting for her people, for the Dominion. Her duty to her people was something sacred. But this human, this stranger, had turned everything she had ever been taught upside down. He wasn't driven by the need for glory or to serve a higher cause. He just wanted to survive. And in that strange, human desire, Neri found something unexpected, a flicker of something she hadn't thought possible. You're a coward then, Neri said, her words cutting through the silence. You ran from your duty. Jake let out a long, slow breath, his fingers gripping the controls more tightly. Maybe. But if running means staying alive, then I'll gladly call myself a coward. I'm not the one out here dying for some idea of honor. Neri didn't respond. She understood the bitterness in his words, even if she didn't fully agree with his viewpoint. But as the Nomad weaved its way through the asteroid field, Neri felt a shift inside her. Maybe there was more to Jake than just a deserter. Maybe there was something in him that wasn't quite as simple as it seemed. Hold on, Jake said suddenly, his voice intense. We're almost clear. I need your help to get us out of this. Neri's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? What can I do? Jake's voice dropped to a low whisper. I need you to use your abilities. Help me mask our signature, distract their scanners long enough for me to get us out of this field. Neri hesitated for a moment, unsure. The use of her telepathic abilities in such a high-stakes moment was dangerous, especially with her still healing. But looking into Jake's eyes, into the determination and trust that had somehow formed between them in such a short time, she found herself willing to try. I can't do this unless you give me full control of the ship's systems, Neri warned, her voice serious. Do it, Jake said without hesitation. I trust you, Neri took a deep breath. Her bioluminescent markings flickering as she concentrated. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the ship's systems pulse around her. It was like second nature to her, a connection to the ship she had never experienced before. She reached out with her mind, gently weaving through the ship's technology, tapping into the hidden quantum fluctuations that powered its systems. Slowly, a faint pulse of light began to emanate from her skin, as if her very essence was syncing with the ship. The quantum systems in the Nomad flickered in response, bending the ship's signature in the fabric of space. Neri felt a rush of power surge through her, and for a moment, she felt a strange bond with the ship, more than just a means of escape, but something alive, something she could mold. The Alliance patrol vessels, still hot on their trail, began to falter. Their scanners were suddenly flooded with false readings, phantom signatures that made it impossible for them to track Jake and Neri's position. Now, Jake. Neri urged. Jake punched the throttle forward, pushing the Nomad into overdrive. The ship accelerated, slipping through the asteroid field with impossible precision. The Alliance ships hesitated, unsure of their next move, as the Nomad disappeared into the depths of space. After a few tense moments, the familiar hum of the ship's systems returned to normal, and the pursuing ships had been left behind in the wreckage of the asteroid field. Jake exhaled sharply, his fingers relaxed on the controls. "We're clear," he said quietly, a trace of awe in his voice. Neri opened her eyes, her markings dimming as she released her hold on the ship's systems. Her body was exhausted, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. The bond between them had shifted again, something unspoken had passed between them. Something that neither could name yet, but for now, they were alive. And that, in this galaxy of war and conflict, was enough. Survival and confusion, the journey was far from over. Even as the tension began to ease, the questions that lingered between them hung in the air. Neri, still recovering from her wounds, was silent in the med bay as she processed everything that had happened. She had been an officer in the Auri Special Forces, trained to fight for the Dominion, to protect her people. But here she was, aboard the ship of a human deserter, saved from death and given a second chance at life. The soft hum of the Nomad's engines filled the air as Jake walked into the med bay, his movements slow but purposeful. He had been keeping busy, adjusting the ship's course, making sure they were on track. He stopped by Neri's bed. Glancing down at her as she sat up slightly, her eyes watching him carefully, "You look better," Jake commented, his voice quieter than usual. "You're still pale, but you're not bleeding out anymore." Neri nodded slowly. Her body ached, and she could still feel the lingering burn of her injuries, but Jake's treatment had helped more than she had expected. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice low and steady. Jake shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would have done." Neri's eyes flickered with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "I'm not like you," she said, her voice strained. "I'm an officer in the Auri Special Forces. You risked everything to save someone like me, a soldier from the enemy. Why?" Jake leaned against the wall, staring at her for a long moment. He couldn't explain it, not fully. He had seen enough death, too much. Human, Auri, it didn't matter anymore. But Neri was different. She was alive. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he had done something good. "I'm not a soldier anymore," he replied finally. "I walked away from that life. And I don't know why I saved you. Maybe I just didn't want to see you die." Neri looked at him, still struggling to understand the depth of his words. "I don't know what to make of you, human. You saved my life, but you don't want anything in return. It's confusing." Jake shrugged, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "I guess that makes two of us." For the first time, Neri smiled, small, but genuine. It was the first real smile she had given since she had been rescued, and it marked the beginning of something neither of them could yet comprehend, a bond that would go far beyond survival. A shared mission, the Nomad hummed quietly as it drifted through the empty void, far from any major routes, deep in the unknown reaches of space. Jake sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls. Neri, still recovering but now more alert, sat next to him. The quiet between them had become more comfortable as they had spent the past several days in each other's company, the weight of their pasts pushing them toward an uncertain future. "I've been doing some thinking," Neri began, breaking the silence. Her voice was still soft, but there was a new edge of determination in it. Jake glanced over at her, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah." "About what?" Neri hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Helios Corporation," she said finally, her voice laced with suspicion. "They've been manipulating the war, fueling both sides, creating chaos to feed their profit." Jake frowned, adjusting the ship's trajectory as he processed what she was saying. "Helios? The corporation that's been arming both the Auri and human forces for years?" "Exactly," Neri replied. "But it's more than that. There's something else going on. I found anomalies in Helios communications, discrepancies in their supply routes and military reports. They're not just selling arms. They're playing both sides, controlling the narrative, ensuring this war never ends." Jake let her words settle in. He had suspected something more was behind the war's endless cycle of destruction. But to hear it from Neri, someone who had been on the front lines, a part of the Auri military, struck him like a jolt of electricity. He had seen too many lives lost to this war, too many people caught in a conflict that seemed to go on without purpose, without end. "Why didn't you speak out earlier?" Jake asked, his voice low. "It wasn't safe," Neri said, her eyes darkening. "Helios controls everything: communications, supply chains, even the Auri Dominion's top officials. Any resistance to them is crushed before it can even begin. I was investigating from the inside, looking for proof, but it wasn't until you saved me that I found the real evidence. The data we need to expose them." Jake's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the mission already pressing down on them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about stopping the war, about saving the countless lives that had been destroyed by the manipulations of a few greedy corporations. "So, what do we do now?" Jake asked, turning to face her fully. Neri's violet eyes locked onto his, her expression determined. "We expose Helios. We make the truth known to both sides. We end this war." Jake didn't need to say anything. The shared understanding between them was enough. They were in this together now, two enemies bound by a single cause, to stop the war, no matter the cost. Betrayal. The tension between Jake and Neri had become a quiet but palpable force. They spent days in space, analyzing the data they had gathered and preparing to expose Helios' role in the war. Jake's mind was constantly turning over the logistics of getting the information to the right people, the right channels. He knew they needed to act fast, before Helios could cover their tracks. But just as they were preparing to make their move, everything fell apart. Sauron, the contact Jake had trusted for years, was the one who betrayed them. Jake's heart sank when he saw the message flash across the Nomad's comms. Sauron had sold them out to the Alliance. The moment the transmission ended, alarms blared through the ship. The Alliance was closing in on their position. There was no time to process the betrayal. No time for regret, Sauron. Jake muttered under his breath, his hand slamming the comms console off. He knew the moment they made contact with the Alliance, their lives would be forfeit. Sauron had never been a friend, Jake had known that from the start. But to sell him out, sell both him and Neri out, was something else entirely. "We need to leave, now." Neri shouted from the cockpit, her eyes wide with urgency. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He fired up the engines and yanked the throttle, sending the Nomad into a hard dive as the ship's alarms blared. The industrial outpost they had been docked at was surrounded by Alliance ships, and there was nowhere to run. Gunfire rained down on the station as the Nomad tore through the atmosphere, dodging explosions and debris. Inside the station, the echoes of battle reverberated through the narrow corridors. Neri, her injuries far from healed, was already at the rear of the ship, helping Jake load the precious data drives into a secure compartment. "We can't let them get this," Neri said, her voice tight with a mix of pain and urgency. "Don't worry. They won't." Jake's voice was grim, his eyes scanning the holographic map as he plotted their escape route. But the Alliance was already closing in. The merciless pursuit would not stop. The gunfire intensified as the doors to the cargo bay burst open, Alliance soldiers flooding into the room. Jake grabbed his weapon, taking cover behind a set of crates, firing back at the soldiers who stormed in. "Get to the shuttle!" Jake shouted over the comms, his pulse pounding as he held the line. "I'll cover you." Neri didn't hesitate. She dashed toward the emergency escape hatch, her feet pounding against the metal floor. Her wounds were still raw, but the urgency of the situation seemed to give her strength. She made it to the shuttle, the small craft barely enough for both of them to escape, let alone survive. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he laid down cover fire, his mind racing. He had to get Neri out. Had to protect the data. He couldn't let the Alliance, or Helios, win. As Neri reached the shuttle, an explosion rocked the station, sending a blast of heat and debris toward Jake. He barely ducked in time, the shockwave throwing him off balance. For a moment, he thought he was done for, but Neri, now aboard the shuttle, turned around. Her bioluminescent markings flickered a deep crimson, and with a flick of her wrist, she manipulated the energy around her, creating a field of distortion that sent the enemy soldiers scrambling. Jake seized the moment, making a break for it, diving into the shuttle just as the doors slammed shut. The shuttle blasted off, leaving the chaos of the industrial outpost behind. But as they shot through space, the weight of what had just happened settled on them both. The betrayal by Sauron stung, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was no going back now. The connection between them deepened in that moment, a shared understanding of survival, of trust, and of what they had to lose. Making a stand, Jake and Neri sat in the dimly lit cockpit of the Nomad, their ship now hidden in the shadows of a rundown space station far from any prying eyes. The data they had salvaged from Helios was encrypted, but they had managed to crack it, revealing a terrifying web of manipulation, a conspiracy that stretched across both human and Auri governments. They couldn't keep running. They had to make a stand. Neri stood up, moving to the communication terminal, her movement still slow from the toll of her injuries. "We need to broadcast this," she said, her voice resolute. "The truth. Let the people see what Helios is really doing." Jake nodded, his hands flying over the console as he activated the secure transmission network. He knew this was risky, broadcasting such a huge revelation could get them killed, but it was their only chance to expose the truth. "Ready when you are," Jake said, his voice thick with determination. Neri's violet eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't expect the human population, or the Auri Dominion, to simply forgive and forget. But maybe, just maybe, this broadcast could change everything. She moved beside him, her fingers brushing the console as she helped calibrate the system. She knew that this moment, this transmission, could alter the course of the war, and of their lives. "Let's do it," she said softly. Jake pressed the button to start the broadcast, and the transmission surged out into the void. The data they had uncovered, the proof of Helios' involvement in fueling the war for profit, was now being sent to both human and Auri military channels, as well as civilian networks. The results were immediate. The feed was picked up across both factions, and soon, the screens flickered to life with images of government officials, military leaders, and diplomats reacting in shock and disbelief. Across the universe, people began to wake up to the truth. For a long moment, Jake and Neri watched the broadcast unfold, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were risking everything, but it was the only way. As the feed continued, a crackling voice came through the comms, an urgent transmission from a human diplomat. "We need you and your Auri companion at the Peace Summit, immediately. The truth you've revealed has shaken the foundations of both our governments. We can no longer ignore the manipulation of Helios." Neri looked at Jake, her violet eyes wide with disbelief. "A peace summit? Jake smiled faintly. Looks like we're not out of the fire yet.